Hello, and welcome to Cultural Context, a brief introduction to Japanese detective fiction. As we've discussed, when we study a text, it can be helpful and even essential to consider the culture and time period in which it was written. So in this video, we are going to whittle down the vast scope of Japanese literary tradition to focus on just a few elements and events that are particularly relevant to our text and our discussion. So again, as usual, it's an extremely brief history that we're getting here. Because we can't do all of Japanese history, of course, but we're going to kind of start around the time that we see as the beginning of detective fiction. So during the Edo period that ran from 1603 to 1867, Japan was under the rule of a shogunate, which is a feudal system under military rule. So a lot of control in that period. The period was characterized by a few traits, including its isolationist policies, which means Japan was largely closed to other countries. Few people from outside of Japan came in, and few people from inside went out. So that's a pretty long time, particularly when you think in the context of other countries doing quite a lot of kind of exploring and colonizing during those periods. Japan remained pretty isolated to itself in that time period. Inside the country, Japan had a lot of economic and political stability. It was peaceful. There wasn't a lot of, it was even a period of economic growth. But with those came a lot of a lack of social mobility. Typically, people stayed in the class to which they were born. There wasn't a lot of moving up and down in the social structure. And most people were born peasants whose work was largely agricultural. So people were kind of kept within that agricultural peasant class and weren't able to move outside of it very much. In 1853, which you see is towards the end of the Edo period, the shogunate opened 2 ports to foreign trade. And what that means is they had a huge influx of exposure to international influence. And that had a rapid and large effect on the Japanese people. In fact, that's what led to the fall of the shogunate in a matter of roughly 15 years. Being exposed to all these international influences and ideas rapidly changed the history of Japan, and it was replaced, the Edo period, the shogunate was replaced within 15 years by a constitutional monarchy. Now, this new system of government and the influx of Western ideals led to more rapid change in Japanese culture through a process called Bunmei Kaika, which means civilization and enlightenment. This was a period where those things were emphasized. Between 1868 and 1912, Japan saw the development of a comprehensive railroad system, which led to a lot more travel within the country. You know, even as they were an isolated power, people didn't necessarily move around within the country that much. So they might not go much further than the place of their birth over the course of their whole lifetime. But as this period in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the development of the railroads meant people could now see much more of Japan. And they also created a mandatory educational system, which grew the already high literacy rate. The Japanese already had a higher than average literacy rate, but with this mandatory educational system that all children began to attend, the literacy rate just skyrocketed even more. And so you had a lot of people who could read, and you had a lot of people who were now on railroads, traveling and having that downtime. So that also led to a growth of daily newspapers. They became quite common and widely available. You see an example of one here in the picture. Like their Western counterparts, these newspapers fed the public interest in, grittier stories, building on some traditional Japanese interests. The Japanese always had kind of an interest in crime stories, and largely a couple of kinds. The dokufu narratives, which are the poison women narratives, think of them as similar to the American literary tradition of the Black Widow legends. The idea that this evil woman who will appear, appear differently, maybe even be quite attractive, that she's actually lethal underneath it all. And that's the poison woman narratives. Those go back as far as our Black Widow ones do, with the idea of in folk tales and in news stories and in literary tradition. And also what they called the Torimono Cho, the crime reports. So crime reports were common in literary tradition, and then within the news, as it grew, as more people were reading the paper, there were more crime reports that were spread. The end of the 1800s also saw the creation of a more comprehensive rule-based justice system, one that reflects the cultural values of order and responsibility. So this was very rules-based. You do this, you don't do this. And that's when it really started to solidify into a consistent justice system across the country. Now, we already know that detective fiction is often born from times of chaos, when economic and social roles are changing, when a place has rapid urban development and population movement. So it's no surprise that this period of time led to the development of Japanese detective fiction as well. Crucial to the genre's development were a few people. First, Ruiko Kuroiwa, that he was a translator. He translated countless texts into Japanese because he believed these stories, in particular, these detective stories, could act as clues to the Western world. As people were newly being exposed to the Western world, these stories, he believed, were more than any others going to help people understand the Western world. He was an especially influential translator because he provided introductions to the text, acquainting the Japanese with the conventions of detective fiction. He's the one who started to teach the Japanese about the conventions that we have been studying. For instance, in one introduction, he had to explain that detective mysteries typically weren't solved until the end of the story, the end of the text. And that's a concept that had not been part of traditional Japanese literature. The idea that you would have a central question or unknown that you would have to read the whole piece to get the answer to, that really didn't have a place in traditional Japanese literature. So he had to introduce that idea. In the translations, he also changed character names to Japanese names that sounded similar, and changed locations and details to make them more familiar to Japanese audiences. For instance, if there were people wearing suits, men wearing suits in the text he was translating, he would change it to kimonos. And this kind of thing, obviously, you can't do it now because of copyright laws. You wouldn't be able to translate a text and then just change details and names to make them more relatable to your audience. But at the time, there were no such copyright laws. So he was able to engage more Japanese readers in this genre than ever before, and more Japanese readers in this genre than in other genres that were being translated, because he made them more accessible to those readers. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese interest in the West started to wane. Kind of in an exchange, people became way more interested in Japanese identity. And that has a few factors at playing in it. Some of it is that Japan had some military victories and had even annexed Korea in 1910. When we talk about South and North Korea today, a lot of that has to do with Japanese annexing it in the beginning of the 20th century. So elsewhere, you can go read that history, and that can help you understand North and South Korea today a lot better. But at that time, Japan, as it was opening up to the world, it was starting to have victory and success itself, which kind of pushed people away from Western influences and back into national pride. So with that shift in national focus, the genre of detective fiction moved away from Western translations. And this is kind of in the first decades of the 1900s, the 20th century. They moved away from the Western translations and influences to draw more heavily from a Japanese tradition. So this meant they often placed stories in the Edo era as already, even though we were only a few decades out of that time period, people were already nostalgic for a time when no other countries had influence on Japanese culture. So the story started to be more commonly set in those time periods. And during that period, there was a man that kind of became the biggest name, Hirai Taro, but he was best known by his pen name, Edogawa Rampo. That's him to the right, that picture with the gun. Edogawa Rampo. When you say the name aloud, or when I say it, perhaps you'll notice that it kind of sounds a little bit like Edgar Allan Poe. That was on purpose. Taro picked this as his pen name because as an homage, a tribute to the inventor of the modern detective story. Rampo was the best known and most widely read Japanese detective fiction writer of all time, kind of like our Agatha Christie in Britain. His first story, The 2-Sen Copper Coin, was published in 1923, so right in line with our Golden Age period. It's seen as the beginning of Japanese created detective fiction. So this is where we were moving away from translating existing texts and starting to write Japanese detective fiction of its own. Interestingly, this story, The 2-Sen Copper Coin, it employs a first-person narrator who is both the sidekick to the detective and, ultimately, the murderer, which leads many modern readers to see it as an imitation of Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. But actually, this story was published a few years before Christie's novel. Since there was little, if any, English translations of Rampo's work, there's no reason to think that Christie ever read this story. So what we get here is a coincidence, one that this is not the only example of. It's this coincidence and others contribute to what historians and critics call cultural simultaneity, which refers to the phenomenon of separate cultures simultaneously developing the same ideas without any interaction between them. So Christie wasn't reading Rampo. Rampo, at least with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, was not reading Christie. So it's cultural simultaneity. In two separate cultures that weren't exposed to each other, the same concept arose, which is really interesting. We see a lot of examples of that throughout literary history. Though he started with more traditional stories, Rampo's work became stranger over time. His work incorporated a lot of horror elements, focusing on the darkest sides of human nature. He wrote about people on the outskirts of society in grotesque and cold ways. For instance, one of his best-known stories is called The Human Chair. It involves a man living hidden inside a chair. Yes, hidden inside a chair, and obsessing over the women who sit on him. So if that sounds weird to you, it is weird. Rampo got into kind of weird horror elements in addition to his detective stories. He also often employed the inverted structure, which is where the killer's identity is known from the beginning, and the book follows the detective's investigation into the how and why behind that killing. But despite the strange and unique elements of Rampo's stories, he continues to be one of the most celebrated Japanese writers of all time. Indeed, the annual prize for Japanese detective writing is the Edogawa Rampo Award. So that's the big prize that you can win, is the Edogawa Rampo Award. After Rampo, the next person to have a large influence on the style of this genre was Matsumoto Saicho. As you've likely learned in history class, much of World War II played out in the Pacific, with the Japanese acting as one of our biggest adversaries. You know, they bombed Pearl Harbor, for instance. Well, the war had a huge impact on Japanese literature as well. During the war, there was relatively little time for or focus on reading for enjoyment. There was official censorship of some texts and a widespread disapproval for frivolity, meaning people didn't see leisure, the ways people might use their leisure time was seen as frivolous, and people didn't really put a lot of respect on that. They disapproved of leisure activities. And so detective fiction in Japan really suffered. But Saicho Saiko, who rose to prominence in the 1950s, led to a rebirth of the genre through what he called the Shaikaiha style, which means social school. This style cared far less for puzzles and fair play, focusing instead on the social issues of crime. He wrote grittier stories focused on the urban underbelly, police procedurals, often with corrupt law enforcement officers and precise realism. So we were following law enforcement, we're looking at the gritty underbelly of society, and we're going to get really real here. He's also focused on the social effects of crime. His style is very similar to the hard-boiled American writers who exemplified a kind of nihilism, which means a general rejection of institution in the belief that life is generally pointless. We saw that a lot in the hard-boiled styles of American writers, and it was big time here. It's though notable that in Japanese style, the gritty underbelly was typically a bit tamer in comparison to the Western nihilist style, but it still was looking a lot at the social effects of crime and the dark underbelly of society. In the decades after the war, Japan continued to change, as did detective fiction. The 1970s saw the beginning of the Hankaku style, which you can think of as the orthodox style. It's marked by a return to the puzzle solving and a focus on the detective's reasoning skill. These contemporary Japanese mysteries share a few traits, such as the relatively low presence of sex and gore, so not very explicit in either the violence or the sexual nature of the text. They have contemporary rather than historical settings, so we've swung back away from placing the stories in the Edo period. Typically, the killer and victim have an existing relationship. So it's not as many serial killers or stranger murder as we might have seen before. As one critic put it, their anxiety is not about the rest of the world, but the dangers of home. And that makes sense in the context of how much of Japanese history has been isolated. It's the dangers of home that now speak the most to Japanese literary traditions, because typically we weren't engaging, or the Japanese weren't engaging with outsiders. So it's the dangers of the people you know the best that are to be worrisome. The motives are often psychological, moral, or relational, rather than financial. For instance, maintaining a person's reputation is a common motivation for crime or the complications surrounding it. Often here we also see the Rampo and Saiko influences of the how done it or the why done it over the who done it. So it means we're still seeing cases where we might know who did it from the beginning, but we're focused on how or why they did it in the piece. They're going to be imaginative, sometimes complex murders. How the crime is committed is often quite elaborate and quite creative. And although the detective's logical reasoning matters, these stories are like Golden Age traditions in that they glorify order and reason. So it matters to get to the end and put everything back into its place. We use logic to do that, but the ultimate goal of order and reason matters a lot. Incidentally, the 1980s and 1990s brought a boom of women writers in Japan, particularly women writers of detective fiction. So while we've been discussing men mostly and we're reading a man, they aren't all or even most of the contemporary landscape. With the Equal Employment Opportunity Law, which passed in 1986 in Japan, more women joined the workforce, more women put off having children, and more women earned their own disposable income. Those things are similar to what's happened in the United States. So that means there were a lot more women that were now reading detective fiction or reading at all, and a lot more writing their own fiction, which means there are a lot more women writers on the landscape today. But let's talk about the author of the text we are reading. Keigo Higashino. He was born in 1958 in Osaka, one of the biggest cities in Japan that's located in the middle to the west side of the country. He studied to be and was an electrical engineer until his unpublished novel, Hokkaido, won the Edogawa Rampo Prize in 1985. When he won that prize, it was a big deal, and it allowed him to stop working as an engineer and write full time. Since then, Higashino has written more than 35 novels, short story collections, and children's books. Hopefully, not a lot of murder in those. Many of these have been translated into English. He's selling millions of copies and has earned himself a place among the most celebrated contemporary Asian writers. Somebody whose books, and you see these covers over here, you might see these covers in any bookstore you walk into. He's sold well in the United States. As a mystery writer, he comes from the Hankaku tradition, that orthodox style, which makes the writers of the Golden Age, like Agatha Christie, among the influences of his style. But he also takes very much from the Japanese tradition with the psychological and social elements of people like Rampo and Seiko. Those are big influences on his work as well. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal in 2011, Higashino said about his work, "I want people to read my work and come to understand how Japanese people think, love, and hate." In an ideal situation, we would take the time to read one of these books. But in the interest of time, what we're going to do instead is watch a film adaptation of one of them, The Devotion of Suspect X. Now, unfortunately, in recent history, the Japanese adaptation is no longer available for streaming in the US. So we are going to be watching a 2017 adaptation from China. So please know that I am not trying to conflate Japanese and Chinese culture. There are going to be many elements of the movie that speak more to Chinese culture than to Japanese culture. They are not the same thing. But again, because this is what we have available to us, we are going to watch that. We don't have time to go into the lengthy history of Chinese cinema. So we're going to view this as a Japanese text, even though we are looking at a Chinese version of it, an adaptation of it. So we'll keep that in mind, that this is not, a perfect scenario, but we can get some idea about the similarities of culture, and then also thinking about how the story is structured, because the structure of the story remains the same. The roles of the characters remain the same. So we can think about the characters and the plot and see that as a product of Japan, even though we're watching a Chinese movie. Hope you will forgive that kind of messiness. I'm sorry, it's not a more perfect situation, but I hope that either way you enjoy the movie and that we can learn a little bit about how these detectives and the roles of the detective has been influenced by Japanese culture and how it is manifesting these days. All right, enjoy.